It's good to be with you again. I'm a grateful recipient of the gifts that these professors and their colleagues have extended to all of us in their intricate and fluid hermeneutical works contained in Mirrored Reflections. So thank you. Throughout its pages, I can hear the palpable sounds of silence breaking. The sounds of silence breaking are harsh and small, resonant and soft, chaotic, furious, terrified, and the sounds of silent breaking are indeed triumphant. The sounds emerging from these texts are profound because they carry the rustling movements of God's beloved as they name and begin to dismantle the layers of subjugation that they face at the intersection of a genderized and racialized identity. And there is indeed, lived in these pages, a great deal of rustling sound as each scholar describes her experience of chafing friction between her truest self and a world that condenses her to a compliant, quiet, conveniently useful part in the normative patriarchal order of identity politics. Visualize with me the natural contours of your body, the lines that demarcate the end of your own flesh and yourself, and the beginning of the air that surrounds you. This demarcation where the self and the social world meets. For some, the demarcation line is hardly noticed between the self and the world, because the outside air is mild and soft to their skin. Their self-understanding is neither questioned nor ridiculed. Their way of looking at the world is affirmed and verified at the site of the main public square. They walk into Pasadena restaurants and into seminary classrooms freely and naturally. Those around them are never surprised that they are articulate in speech and astute in their theological inquiry. For others, however, the demarcation line between self and the world is far more complex and unnatural. Before their own sense of self has a chance to grow in definition and strength, the world imposes its understanding and its assessment of the value of their identities. When they are young, they draw self-portraits that replace their black hair with brown crayons, their dark eyes with blue crayons. They develop an almost innate first-order sensibility for scanning a room and in a nanosecond register what that particular context requires of them. And others are regularly surprised that they speak English without an accent. That they are regularly surprised that they eloquently offer insightful comments in a seminary classroom. Still others are dumbfounded and they turn brilliantly red when one of these for whom the air hurts her skin stops in her tracks, walks a few steps backwards to turn to their ignorant and ridiculous mimicking of her language and of her eyes, and inundate their mistaken entitled space with an incisive verbal essay to match the ching-chong about the pitiful systemic conditions that produce such pitiful actions by adults like them. there are indeed occasional moments of triumph. But those of us for whom the demarcation between our self-identities and the specification requirements of the world are jagged at best, our relational, educational, professional, and ministerial experiences are narrated with scars from chafing frictions that we incur when we decide to show up at the public square as our full selves, with the full sound of our voices. As awkward and still developing they may be at times, as whole and prophetic they may be at times. It is no wonder that the courageous authors of this compilation resound voice that are both strong and timid, resolute and tentative, unyielding and generous, yin and yang, as Dr. Herdig lucidly offers in a paradigmatic chapter, a chapter in which she describes a harmonious chaos of women and the possibilities of conceptualizing and embodying an alternative theological vision of both and, to the false either-or and over-against dichotomies that pervade through and through in both academic and ecclesial domains. In this foundational chapter, Dr. Herdig names the agility embedded in the lives of women who endure the throbbing sting of chafed, sometimes bleeding skin, and who then develop mechanical strategies and muscular souls to stand and live again, but this time with more authenticity, with more agency, and with much more audacity. Perhaps more than some are prepared to handle. Perhaps more than some of us in this room would want to engage with. I want to remind my Asian American women colleagues of the danger of this kind of authentic theological task. I borrow the words of an Asian American pioneer poet, Nellie Wong, who says, "If you sing too often of woes, yours and your sisters, you may be charged with being too personal, too autobiographical, too much a woman who cries out, who acknowledges openly, shamelessly, the pain of living and the joy of becoming free." The danger of being the target of such a charge, and the real danger of academic scorn, are the risks you take by having supplied your lived narratives as a down payment for the promise of a constructive Asian American theology. For the risk you are willing to take in writing this book, more so for the risky steps you have taken in your respective paths, the risky words you have spoken, and for the risk of disclosing your mistakes and shortcomings, each of you embody the posture of a true teacher for me. I marvel at the ways that Dr. Sun describes herself and her voice as yet unfinished, still growing and struggling in that freeing transformation from invisibility to presence, from self-doubt to voice. Like you, I too know a little bit about invisibility and self-doubt, especially in the face of a classroom of students when all the social categories of authority and hierarchy are against my social identity as young Asian female professor. I too know, however, an experience in those same classrooms and lecture halls and pulpits, that God's intended design of me and of call on my life vocation is much more than what time, circumstances, and history have made me to be. Professor Jin, had you been born in the United States as a male and white, I am convinced, based on your chapter on leadership, multivocality, and hospitable spaces, that you would today be spearheading a leading theological institution, rather than giving tirelessly of your intelligence and gifts to projects in an institution that is slow to recognize the rare assets you bring to visionary administrative leadership. Your chapter reminded me of an advice a mentor gave me about faculty meetings. She said, "Don't be afraid to speak and announce your statements before every thought is carefully vetted in your mind. Because your male colleagues will say obvious and dull things that you can easily match, but they will receive credit for their ingenuity and insight." Your chapter also reminds me that humility doesn't always mean being willing to stay patiently and quietly behind. But humility before God's design and purpose for our lives sometimes requires taking the step forward, perhaps taking more steps forward towards the center than I am taught to be comfortable with, and claiming my unique presence, voice, and role in my community. I reference these chapters as a kind of a down payment towards a possible future of regenerative Asian American theology, a theology that doesn't remain confined to books and conceptual models, but a living, moving, breathing, growing theology that informs and reforms the church, just as it remains tentative to be reformed by the new expressions of life and faith made by the church and by the world to which the church is called to serve. As I have subtly suspicioned, there are likely some who do not embrace your theological conjectures, your methodology, your interpretations, or even the casual rawness of your autobiographical narratives that mess up whatever organization of orthodox hermeneutics they presume to own. And that's okay. At least now the down payment has been made at a costly price. And now it is the responsibility for all of us to respond to the investment, at the very least to react to it. What I mean is that now something has been put on the table. A language and a posture for doing theology have been served. A name has emerged, Yinist theology. A location for theology has been identified. Lived life vis-a-vis the lives recorded in the canon of the Christian Bible. A subversive agenda has been proposed, a radical reorientation that sees the peripheral margins of a still-centered lake as the place where wild, beautiful, and sacred things thrive. So we must all ask ourselves and ask our church, what shall we do now? What shall we say to this? I want to address for just a brief while those who benefit from the religio-cultural structures of our Asian American church that privileges male and male authority. That is all of you, my brothers. Whether you readily recognize it or not, you possess power. So you also possess power to relinquish the church's theology, polity, and cultural norms from the tight grip of patriarchy and preoccupation with orthodoxy, so that the church can be free to live into an authentic faith community and to speak theologies, literally God words, that reflect the experiences of the Spirit by all in God's kingdom. My question for you is this: will you take an upfront costly risk, a matching funding of sorts, by placing faith in God who desires to manifest and build up such a kingdom dwelling among our earthly tents where no one is denied entry or denied mutual agency or denied ordained appointment or favor based on their low place in the hierarchical structures of identity politics of our day? I hope that your daughters and sons, the young people in your congregation, the precious seminarians that fill this room here today, who are looking to you and to the church, I hope that they will find you co-laboring, leading the constructive work of building a theology that seems to me can only begin with a deconstructive work of naming and dismantling the walls that insulate our theology, polity, and embedded cultural norms from the presently muddled sounds of silence breaking, seeking desperately to be heard. Upon your listening, my brothers, even if it is an obligatory listening for just one day or for just one book, even if it is, this is all well and good, but this isn't really going to change my perspective kind of listening, and if it is the kind of attentive listening that I have experienced among many of you, a kind of critical listening that communicates an expectation to learn and to grow together as a result, I hope that upon your listening, you will be prompted to dialogue, to examine, and to question what has now been voiced and transcribed in this powerful and profound publication. I learn a lot from women. This past November, I was part of a consultation hosted by AAES, Association of Theological Schools, for Women in Leadership. A dozen senior women faculty, women presidents, and women deans were gathered with about 30 emerging women leaders among its member schools in the US and Canada. I regret to inform you that I was the only Asian participant there. I notice this not because this is anything too remarkable, but because it has made me earnestly hope that the company of women in leadership might grow so that the few are not taking turns one by one to show up at these consultations. In that week of consultation in Pittsburgh, I thought about the many young Asian American women seminarians I've encountered at the last symposium here on this campus. And I hoped to be able to tell you today that there are seats at the table waiting for your arrival. I want to encourage you today to listen to the lives of the women recorded for you in this book and to begin to record your own lives so that you might discover your voice, a voice with which you can examine and question what you are being offered, a voice that will help you to know how to be fully, authentically you. A voice that continues the stories of the saints, the faith stories that is the Bible that is still yet unfinished. Whether you can resonate and find mirrors of your lives and the stories of the women that are named in this book, or when you find and encounter women of the Bible who cause problems for the church, the hidden women, the unnamed women, the terrifying narratives of the women in the Bible that problematize your engagement with the church. That still yet you'll persevere to find your voice that carries on the stories of faith that have begun in the canon of the biblical scriptures. And I want to encourage you, young women seminarians, to stay in the conversation. The one thing that I gleaned from the senior women at the consultation is this: 90% of your job is to show up. Choose to show up as your full self. Just show up. So just as I've simply shown up here today, I'm glad you've shown up. Continue to show up in your classrooms and in your churches as fully you. And don't just sit in the back. Take a seat at the front. As God has with these extraordinary women authors, God just might surprise you with a call on your life that is far more than what you are planning for. Thank you.